The night my father gave my sister the whole future in front of 350 people, my mother sat me near the service door and told me not to embarrass them. 10 minutes later, a gray-haired lawyer I had never seen in my life walked straight to my table with a sealed envelope in his hand. I didn't know it yet, but that envelope was the first time anyone in my family had ever put the truth in writing. My name is Dulce Whitford. I was 28 that night, and for most of my life, my family had a very simple way of explaining me to other people. Miranda was the brilliant one. I was the slow one. That was the whole script. Miranda got the violin lessons, the private prep, the language tutors, the proud introductions, the careful future planning. I got the long sighs and the lowered voices and the polite way rich people say you're a disappointment without using the word disappointment. I have dyslexia. I was diagnosed when I was 7, and I remember the test because the woman doing it was kind, which made it stand out. She told my parents I processed language differently and would need support, patience, maybe specialized reading help. My mother nodded like she was listening. My father asked how severe it was, like he was pricing damage to a building. After that, nothing really changed for me, except the family had a word now: dyslexia. A clean little label they could pull out any time they wanted to explain why I wasn't Miranda. By the time I was 12, I had already figured out that help in our house was not distributed by need. It was distributed by return on investment. Miranda had a whole schedule taped to the refrigerator in color-coded blocks: violin at Juilliard prep, French immersion, debate camp, SAT tutoring with some Princeton guy my mother bragged about because he charged $400 an hour. I asked once, just once, if I could get somebody to help me with reading because I was tired of feeling stupid every time letters slid around on the page. My mother didn't even look up from her phone. She just said, "Dulce, we've already spent so much on specialists. At some point, we have to accept that some children just aren't academic." I remember standing there in the kitchen with my backpack still on, just staring at her. I was 12, so I believed her. That's the part that still gets me. I believe the people who were supposed to know me. After that, I stopped asking. I built my own weird little system because I had to. Audiobooks, color-coded notes, diagrams, arrows everywhere. I could understand complicated things if I could see the shape of them instead of wrestling every line one word at a time. Nobody in my house cared because the point was never to help me learn. The point was to keep Miranda shining and keep me in the role that made her look even brighter. The only person who never treated me like I was defective was my grandmother, Eleanor. Every Sunday, I took the train to her apartment on the Upper West Side, and for a few hours, I got to be a person instead of a family embarrassment. She never rushed me. She never finished my sentences in that fake patient voice people use when they think they're being kind. She'd spread papers out across the coffee table and explain things through stories, pictures, and connections. "You don't miss the point, Dooley," she told me once, tapping the side of my notebook after I'd mapped out a contract with little squares and lines. "You just get there a different way." It sounds small, but when one person talks to you like you're capable after years of being handled like a problem, you remember every word. I did. I also remembered every time she watched my father watching me. He hated those Sundays. Not openly. Gerald Whitford was too polished for that. But he'd make comments. Ask if Grandma was tiring herself out on remedial projects. He thought he was subtle. He wasn't. She saw it. I know she did. The Christmas that finally burned itself into me happened in 2018. My parents hosted one of their big family dinners in the townhouse on the Upper East Side, the kind with catered food and crystal and too many candles and everybody acting like they actually liked each other. There were around 20 of us there. My father stood at the head of the table with a wine glass in his hand and announced, Miranda had been accepted to Harvard Law. Everybody exploded. My aunt cried. My uncle slapped the table. My mother looked like she had personally negotiated the admission. Then my father did what he always did. He took all that warmth he'd been pouring over Miranda and turned toward me with nothing left in it. And Dooley, he said, smiling like he was being charming. Well, Dooley is also here. A few people laughed, not big laughs, the worst kind. The careful little laughs people use when they know something ugly just happened, but they want the night to keep moving. Miranda laughed too. I looked down at my plate because I knew if I looked at anyone, really looked, I was going to cry in front of all of them. Under the table, my grandmother reached across and squeezed my hand so hard it almost hurt. When I looked up, she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her son like she finally understood exactly what he had become. A few months after that dinner, she called me to her apartment and told me to come alone. Her health had started slipping by then, but her mind was still sharp enough to cut glass. She had a small mahogany box sitting beside her chair, and when I walked in, she put it straight into my hands before I even sat down. She told me to keep it safe and not open it yet. I asked what was in it, and she said, "Not something you need today." Then she looked at me in that steady way she had and added, "But one day you will." I wish I could say I understood what she meant in that moment. I didn't. I thought maybe it was sentimental, old papers, jewelry, a family thing. I took the box home and put it in my closet and went back to being the extra daughter in a family that had already decided my place. What I didn't know then was that my grandmother had already stopped trusting my father with the future, and she had already started planning for the day he'd go too far. By the time I graduated from a state school in 2022, my family had already built a neat little explanation for why my degree didn't count. It wasn't Harvard. It wasn't Columbia. It wasn't anything they could say at a fundraiser and watch people nod. But I still thought maybe I had one path left: the company. If I worked at Whitford Properties, if I showed up every day and learned the business from the inside, maybe they'd stop treating me like some sad extra from the family photos. That was the lie I was still living in then. Not that they loved me. I think by that point I knew better. But I still believed usefulness might earn me a place. My father hired me as an administrative assistant and acted like he was doing charity. My salary was $42,000 a year. That same month, Miranda came in through the front door as chief legal counsel, making $280,000 plus bonuses. Nobody even tried to pretend those two things belonged in the same universe. My desk wasn't in any real department. It sat in a weird corner outside operations near the copy room, close enough to hear important people talking, and far enough that nobody felt the need to lower their voice around me. I booked conference rooms, printed packets, tracked calendars, fixed travel snafus, and brought coffee to men who would look straight past me while saying, "Can you have your assistant handle this?" I was the assistant. Half the executives never bothered learning my name. I'd hear Darla, Dana, sweetheart, once even intern, which was honestly almost funny because I was 26 and had been there almost a year. Miranda had a glass office, catered lunches dropped during meetings, and a whole reputation before she'd even done anything there. I had a badge that opened side doors, and a father who said things like, "Let's keep Dulce where she's comfortable." Comfortable. He said it like he was protecting me. What he meant was invisible. The thing is, I was paying attention the whole time. I had spent my life learning how to make sense of systems that weren't built for me, and it turned out that skill translated pretty well to corporate nonsense. I couldn't skim a 50-page contract as fast as Miranda could, no, but I could hear 3 executives arguing in the hallway for 6 minutes and know exactly where the weak point in the deal was. I could see how money moved, where obligations overlapped, which partnerships were stable and which ones were held together with ego and bluffing. While I was collating board packets, I'd make little diagrams for myself on scrap paper, arrows and blocks and names, just to see if I was understanding what I heard. Most of the time I was. Once, in late 2023, I quietly caught a filing conflict that would have cost the company a penalty because 2 departments were working off different versions of the same lease amendment. I brought it to my supervisor, Patricia Morales, who had worked there forever and actually still spoke to me like I was human. She stared at the papers for a second, looked back at me, and said, "How did you even catch this?" I just shrugged because I didn't know how to explain something I'd been doing all my life without sounding defensive. She fixed it through the right channels. The issue disappeared. A week later, I heard my father congratulating Miranda for maintaining legal oversight. She had not touched that file. I had. I stood there in the copy room with toner on my fingers, listening to him praise the wrong daughter for work she didn't even know existed. That's the kind of thing that changes you slowly. Not one big slap, just the same message over and over. You are useful in private and erasable in public. My grandmother had seen that pattern before I did. Back in those Sunday visits, before her health got bad, she used to spread old company documents across her table and teach me how to read them like structures instead of pages. "Your father reads for leverage," she told me once. "You read for shape." At the time, I thought she was just being nice. Looking back, she was trying to hand me a language my family couldn't take away from me. She knew exactly what kind of company Gerald had turned Whitford Properties into. Everything was image, hierarchy, posture, the right school, the right handshake, the right person talking in the right room. He thought competence looked like confidence in a navy suit. He had no idea what to do with someone like me because I didn't sound like Miranda and I didn't move like him. That became a kind of family religion. Miranda was proof the bloodline still meant something. I was the cautionary tale. Every dinner, every holiday, every work event repeated that story until even I started hearing it in my own head. Then, in April of 2024, I got the email. Subject line, "Position restructuring, confidential." That fake HR voice, all clean edges and corporate sympathy. My role was being eliminated effective July 1st. HR would contact me about severance. I read it 3 times because that's what I always did when something mattered, and I hated that about myself in that moment because it made me feel slow, exactly the way they always said I was. I stayed late that night, pretending to organize archived files while my father and mother talked in his office behind the wall. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop at first. I just froze when I heard my name. My father said, "We can't have her here when Miranda takes over. It looks bad." My mother asked, "What kind of questions?" And he said, "Why she's still in an assistant role. Why we've never moved her up. Why she's the way she is." My mother got very soft then, which somehow made it worse. "We've done everything we could for her, Gerald. Some children just don't have what it takes." I don't know how long I stood there with one hand on a filing cabinet, just staring at nothing. Not because it shocked me exactly. It didn't. It was because I heard how finished they were with me. Not emotionally, structurally. They weren't just ashamed of me anymore. They were clearing me out of the picture before they officially handed everything to Miranda. The next morning, there were flower arrangements arriving at the office and formal wear garment bags hanging in Miranda's office because her graduation party at the Plaza was that night. 350 guests, full orchestra, family friends, investors, the whole polished circus. I remember looking at one of the garment bags and realizing, with this very cold feeling in my stomach, that my firing and her public coronation had been scheduled basically on top of each other. That wasn't an accident. They were ending one daughter and launching the other in the same week. I still went. I don't know if that sounds pathetic, but I went. Some part of me wanted to see how far they were willing to take it. Some part of me, and this is the embarrassing truth, still wanted proof I mattered at least enough to be treated honestly. I got dressed in the best black dress I could afford, looked at myself in the mirror of my tiny Queens apartment, and thought, just get through the night. I had no idea the night was about to crack wide open. The Plaza looked exactly how places like that are supposed to look when rich people want a room to agree with them. Gold light, white flowers, waiters moving like they had rehearsed it. A string of black cars outside, and women stepping out in gowns that cost more than I made in a month. I got there early, because being late to a family event was always treated like a character flaw if I did it, even though Miranda had kept entire tables waiting before, and everyone called it charming. I was standing near the entrance, trying not to stare at the ceiling, when my mother found me. She looked me over from head to toe without even pretending not to. "This is what you wore?" she asked, already irritated. I said it was the nicest thing I had, which was true, and she adjusted her bracelet and said, "You'll be at table 27, near the service entrance. Tonight is Miranda's night, Dulce. Whatever you're feeling, keep it off your face." That was my mother. No hello, no you look nice, just instructions on how not to be visible wrong. Table 27 was half hidden behind a pillar at the back of the ballroom. You could still see the stage, but only if you leaned a little, and every time the service door swung open behind us, you got a blast of kitchen heat and silverware noise. I sat down with two cousins I barely knew and a woman who kept squinting at me like she was trying to place me from a funeral. Up front, there was a giant photo of Miranda in her Harvard regalia, with one of those glossy smiles that looked expensive even printed 6 feet tall. The banner behind the stage said, "Congratulations, Miranda Whitford, Harvard Law Class of 2024. And for some reason, that was the part that got under my skin. Not because she didn't earn her degree, she did, but because even the room had been taught the family script. Miranda is the future. Dulce is somewhere in the back. I kept thinking about the email from HR sitting in my inbox, and the conversation through my father's office wall. And I had this awful feeling that I wasn't just at a party. I was at my own replacement ceremony. At around 8:30 p.m., the lights dipped and the room settled. My father stepped onto the stage with a champagne glass in his hand, smiling that polished donor smile I'd seen on magazine pages and hospital gala brochures my whole life. He talked about excellence and legacy and discipline and how proud he was of Miranda, and the crowd ate it up because of course they did. Then he called her up beside him in that emerald dress and said this wasn't just a celebration of what she'd done, it was an announcement of her future. He said she would inherit the family residence on Park Avenue. He said she would inherit his estate. He said when he retired, she would take over as CEO of Whitford Properties. People actually stood up. Not everyone, but enough that it felt like the whole room rose around me. A woman at my table leaned toward me and asked, almost casually, "So what does that mean for you?" I just looked at her, because I honestly didn't know how to answer that, without saying something humiliating out loud. Then I caught movement near the ballroom doors. There was an older man standing there in a gray suit, silver hair, not drinking, not talking, not applauding, just watching. And after my father finished handing Miranda the whole future like he was presenting a trophy, that man started walking straight toward me. He stopped at my table and asked, very quietly, "Miss Woodford?" I said yes, because I thought maybe he had mistaken me for someone else. He introduced himself as Jonathan Ellis from Morrison and Blake and said he had represented my grandmother. That got my attention so fast it almost made me dizzy. Eleanor had been gone for years. People in my family said her name less and less as time passed, probably because it was hard to talk about the founder when the current king liked acting like history began with him. Ellis reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick cream envelope sealed with red wax and a notary stamp. "Your grandmother left instructions," he said. "I was to give this to you on the day your father publicly made clear who he had chosen." I just stared at him. I remember the wax. I remember how steady his hand was compared to mine. I asked what it was, and he said, "Her will, the real one." Not dramatic, not soft, just factual, like he was telling me what time it was. I took the envelope and left the ballroom so fast I nearly clipped a waiter carrying champagne. I ended up in a service hallway near the kitchen because it was the first place I could breathe. My hands were shaking so hard I almost tore the paper opening it. Inside were 3 pages of legal text, notarized, dated September 12th, 2019. I had to read slowly, lips pressed together, forcing every line into focus, and then I hit the paragraph that made the hallway tilt under me. Eleanor Whitford was leaving me 51% of her shares in Whitford Properties, along with full voting rights. 51%. Majority control. Not a sympathy check, not a trust fund. Control. There was more. She wrote that I had been excluded and diminished, not because I lacked ability, but because I lacked support. She wrote, in plain legal language, that I was not slow. I was abandoned. I had to stop reading for a second because if I didn't, I was going to start crying right there next to a rolling cart of folded napkins and industrial coffee urns. My grandmother had seen all of it. Not just the obvious stuff, the whole arrangement. Then I got to the condition. I had 72 hours to request an emergency board meeting, or the will would go void, and the old testamentary documents would stand. I read that part twice, because it felt cruel for half a second, until I realized it was the opposite. Grandma knew me. She knew if I had too much time, I might talk myself out of it. Ellis was waiting when I came back toward the coat check, like he already knew I'd need one more push. I asked why she would put a deadline like that in something this serious, and he said, "Because your grandmother believed hesitation was the only thing that could still cost you this." He handed me a second card, with his personal number written on the back, and told me the deadline was May 18th at 8:30 p.m. I looked through the ballroom doors and saw my father still smiling for photos with Miranda, still inside the version of the story he thought he controlled. And for the first time in my life, I realized I might actually be holding something he couldn't spin away. That night, back in my apartment in Queens, I finally opened the mahogany box my grandmother had given me years earlier. It was past midnight. My roommates were asleep. I was sitting cross-legged on my bed in a dress I suddenly hated, with mascara half gone and my hair still smelling faintly like hotel perfume and kitchen steam. For a second, I just stared at the lid because I had this weird fear that opening it would make everything too real. Not the inheritance part, the part where my grandmother had known this was coming. Inside was a folded letter on her personal stationery, one old document stamped 1965, and a USB drive. I read the letter first. She wrote exactly the way she talked, direct, no fluff. She said if I was reading it, then Jonathan had done his job, and my father had done what she expected him to do. She said she was sorry she hadn't been able to stop it while she was alive. Then she got to the point. The older document was the original partnership agreement from when she founded Whitford Properties. It established that the founders' shares carried permanent voting rights that could not be diluted or transferred without board approval. My father had never seen it. The USB, she wrote, contained something else. In 2018, Gerald had tried to reduce her voting power from 51% to 10%. His public reason was that she was too old to understand modern business. His real reason was obvious. He wanted control, and she was still standing in the way. The board rejected him. She never forgot it. And then there was the line that stayed with me. He marginalized you because you reminded him of the kind of person he refuses to be. I sat there holding that paper so tight it crumpled at the edge. All those years I thought I was just the weak link in the family. I wasn't. I was the person who made his version of himself harder to believe. The next morning I called the first name I recognized from the will-related notes Jonathan had mentioned, Margaret Coleman. I expected a receptionist, maybe voicemail, maybe some formal barrier. Instead, she answered on the second ring like she had been waiting for me. She knew exactly who I was. She also knew about the will. My grandmother had told her before she died. That part hit me hard because it meant Eleanor had not just left me documents. She had built me a path. Margaret didn't waste time pretending this was some emotional family matter that should be handled privately. She treated it like what it was, a power question with rules attached. She told me an emergency board meeting would require 3 directors to sign the petition. She was one. She believed Richard Holloway and Susan Parker would sign if someone finally forced the issue. Not because they loved me. Because they were tired of my father. That mattered to me, weirdly. It made the whole thing feel less magical and more real. Gerald wasn't untouchable. He was just used to nobody challenging him. Margaret made the calls while I sat at my kitchen table with my grandmother's papers spread out around a chipped cereal bowl and my laptop balanced on a stack of old magazines because my apartment was too small for a real desk. That contrast was almost funny. My father was probably already booking lunch at some club with dark wood walls and private waiters, and I was in Queens, trying to overturn his whole life from between a sink full of dishes and a broken radiator. By that evening, the petition was ready. Meeting requested for May 18th at 10 a.m., Whitford Tower, 42nd floor. Margaret texted me one sentence after it was filed. Your grandmother would be proud. I read that about 6 times. Gerald found out the next afternoon, and the air in the office changed so fast it felt like weather. Miranda called me first. No hello, no fake warmth, just, "What did you do?" Her voice had that tight, thin sound she got when control slipped and she was trying to pull it back with manners. I said I didn't know what she meant, which was petty maybe, but I was done making things easy for her. She said my father had received notice of an emergency board meeting requested by Margaret Coleman and 2 other directors, and Margaret never moved without a reason. Then she said, If this is some stunt because of the party, stop now. You are not equipped for this. That word sat there between us. Equipped. Like I was a machine missing parts. I asked her if she had ever once in her life wondered why the family needed me to stay small for her to feel secure. She went dead silent for a second, then snapped that I was being unstable and hung up. 20 minutes later, my father blew past my desk and slammed his office door so hard the glass rattled. I heard him inside making calls, talking about senility, nuisance, procedural cleanup. And then I heard the line that actually calmed me down. He said, "Dulce can barely read a spreadsheet. She's not a threat to anyone." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because for the first time in my life, their certainty was helping me. They still thought they knew the script. They thought I was hurt, emotional, impulsive, out of my depth. They had no idea I was carrying notarized proof, original founding documents, and the one thing people like my father never prepare for: a quiet person who finally has enough. That night, I got ready in a way I had never gotten ready for anything in my life. Not glamorous ready, not revenge ready, just steady. I printed copies of the will. I backed up the board meeting audio and minutes from the USB onto my phone and laptop. I wrote out a short statement because I knew if I tried to improvise in a room like that, my adrenaline might scramble everything. Jonathan confirmed he'd attend to authenticate the documents. Margaret confirmed the petition was formally on record. I barely slept, but it wasn't the usual spinning panic. It was sharper than that, cleaner. When morning came, I put on a gray blazer borrowed from one of my roommates and carried a second-hand leather portfolio I'd bought for $12 at Goodwill the year before for job interviews that never went anywhere. Whitford Tower looked the way it always looked, all glass and marble and money trying to impersonate permanence. I got off the elevator on the 42nd floor at 9:45 a.m., walked toward the boardroom doors, and the security guard stepped in front of me before I even reached the handle. He checked his tablet, frowned, and said I wasn't authorized to enter. Then Miranda's voice came from behind me, smooth and cold. "That's because she doesn't belong here." I turned around and saw her in navy silk and perfect makeup, already smiling like she had won. Miranda stood there like the hallway already belonged to her. Navy suit, silk scarf, perfect posture, the whole thing. She asked me what I thought I was doing, but not like a real question. More like she was talking down to a receptionist who had wandered into the wrong event. I told her I had something the board needed to see. She gave this short laugh and said, "You work in the copy room, Dulce." Before I could answer, my father came down the hall with two executives behind him, already irritated, already carrying that look he used when somebody had made his day less smooth than he wanted it to be. Miranda turned slightly toward him and said, "She's trying to get into the meeting." Gerald looked at me and didn't even bother hiding the contempt. "Go back to your desk," he said. "This has nothing to do with you." Then the boardroom door opened, and Margaret Coleman stepped out like she had heard enough. She took one look at all three of us and said, "Actually, it does. I invited her." My father's jaw tightened so hard I could see it from 10 feet away. He still moved aside, though. That was the first crack. Not because he agreed, because he couldn't overrule Margaret in front of witnesses without looking exactly like what he was. The boardroom was smaller than I expected, which somehow made it worse. There were 12 leather chairs around a polished walnut table, portraits on the wall, windows framing the city like money itself was supposed to back him up. My grandmother's portrait hung above the fireplace. That hit me the second I walked in. Eleanor, painted in that dark green jacket she used to wear to site visits, looking calm and impossible to impress. Jonathan Ellis was already there with his briefcase. Robert Hartley, the board chair, called the meeting to order, and when Margaret yielded the floor to me, my father jumped in before I even opened my portfolio. He stood up, all slow and composed, and said he needed to provide context because I was his daughter and he loved me, but I was not qualified to address the board on any business matter. He said I had no training, no financial background, no strategic experience. Miranda followed him right into it. She said I had dyslexia and struggled with reading, and they had tried to support me, but some limitations couldn't be fixed with effort. It was so smooth, so practiced. That's the thing people don't always get about humiliation like that. The sting isn't just the words. It's hearing the same family lie carried into a formal room like it belongs in the official record. A few people shifted in their seats. Nobody stopped them at first. Then Hartley cut in and told my father to sit down because I had the floor. Miranda looked at me and mouthed, "You're embarrassing yourself." And that was the exact second something in me went cold. Not numb, clear. They really thought the old story would still work, even now, even here. So I took the will out of my portfolio and held it up. I said, very plainly, that what I was presenting was the last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Whitford, executed in September of 2019. My father actually lost color. Not a little, all at once. He said it was impossible because my grandmother's will had already been handled years earlier. I said what he had was the earlier will, not the final one, and then I asked Jonathan Ellis to confirm the document. Jonathan stood and did exactly that. No drama, no flourish. He stated his name, his firm, his relationship to my grandmother, the execution date, the witnesses, the escrow location of the original. Hartley took the document and started reading, and when he got to the part about 51% of the company shares transferring to me, the whole room changed. You could feel it. Not noise exactly, just people recalculating in real time. Miranda said it had to be a forgery, but her voice had gone thin. Jonathan shut that down in one sentence. My father slammed his hand on the table and said my grandmother had been unwell and manipulated. That was when I pulled out my phone and played the audio from the 2018 board meeting. His own voice filled the room, talking about reducing Eleanor's voting rights because she was too old to understand modern business. When the clip ended, nobody said anything for a second. There wasn't really anything to say. The man claiming confusion and undue influence had already documented his own motive. Hartley asked me to read the relevant section of the will aloud for the record, and I did. Slowly, carefully. I read the part where my grandmother wrote that I had been excluded and denied opportunity, not because I lacked ability, but because I lacked support. I read the line that said I was not slow, I was abandoned. Miranda made this awful choking sound next to my father, like hearing it in my grandmother's own words was somehow worse than living it had been for me. Then I read the line about Gerald confusing credentials with character. Nobody interrupted me that time. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody smiled. After that, I laid out the rest of it. The original founding agreement, the permanent voting rights attached to founder shares, the failed resolution from 2018. Margaret confirmed the vote. Legal counsel left the room, made calls, checked records, came back, and quietly told Hartley the documents were valid. When the board reconvened, Hartley announced that effective immediately, I was the majority shareholder of Whitford Properties and had the right to bring motions regarding executive leadership. My father stood like he was going to protest, and Hartley told him to sit down. That might have been the first time in my life I saw someone speak to Gerald Whitford like he was just a man in a chair. I could have moved to remove him on the spot. Everybody in that room knew it. He knew it too. But I kept thinking about my grandmother, and I knew exactly what I wanted on the record. Not revenge. Not a scene he could call emotional or personal. I proposed a vote of confidence. Let the board decide whether they still trusted Gerald to remain CEO. Miranda called it a spectacle. I said no, it was governance. And if he had the board's confidence, he had nothing to fear. Margaret seconded the motion immediately. Hartley called the vote. 4 hands went up for confidence. Then 7 went up for no confidence. 1 abstained. That was it. 7-4 with 1 abstention. Hartley informed my father that under the bylaws, he had 30 days to tender his resignation. Gerald didn't yell. He didn't threaten me. He just stared at me with this look I had never gotten from him before. Not pity, not annoyance, not disgust. Recognition. Like he had finally understood, way too late, that the daughter he had spent 20 years shrinking was the one person in that room who could end him cleanly. After the meeting broke, people started moving fast in that fake, calm corporate way, gathering papers, avoiding eye contact, speaking low like volume could make the last hour less real. I stayed in my chair for a second because my legs felt strange, almost hollow, like my body had finally noticed what I'd just done. Jonathan brought me a glass of water. Margaret squeezed my shoulder on her way past and said, "Don't let him pull you into a private version of this." She knew him. That mattered, because about 2 minutes later, my father caught me in the corridor outside the boardroom with my mother right behind him. Priscilla's mascara was already streaking. Gerald didn't bother pretending anymore. He called me ungrateful, manipulative, said I had turned a family matter into a public humiliation. That part almost made me laugh, and I think he saw it on my face. I told him I hadn't humiliated him. I had put documents on a table and let other people read them. He said my grandmother had been confused and poisoned against him. I told him she wrote that will 5 months after he tried to strip her power away. So if anyone poisoned that relationship, it was him. Then my mother stepped in with the soft voice she always used when she wanted cruelty to sound like care. She said they had only ever tried to protect me because I struggled, because the world was hard, because not everyone was built for pressure. I looked at her and finally said the thing I should have said years earlier. You didn't protect me. You erased me. She actually flinched. I remember that. Not because it fixed anything, just because for once the sentence landed where it belonged. My father grabbed my arm after that and said this wasn't over. They'd contest everything. I had no idea what I'd started. I pulled free and told him Grandma had planned for that too. Then I got in the elevator and left while they were still standing there, still expecting one more chance to talk me back into my place. The adrenaline wore off somewhere around the lobby. By the time I hit the sidewalk, I wasn't feeling powerful. I was shaking. That's the part people skip when they tell stories like this, I think. They skip the crash. They skip how grief can show up right after relief and sit on your chest like something heavy and familiar. Jonathan found me near the revolving doors and asked what I wanted to do next. I told him the truth. I wanted to go home. I didn't want to be a symbol or a headline or the new face of anything that day. I just wanted to go back to Queens and sit in my stupid little apartment and breathe where nobody was measuring me. The next 24 hours moved without me having to push them. Hartley emailed to say Gerald had submitted his resignation effective June 15th, and the board wanted to offer me a formal role as strategic advisor while they handled the transition. An all-staff email went out. Suddenly, people who had called me sweetie and missed my name for 2 years were messaging me like we were old friends. I ignored almost all of them. The one message I saved came from Patricia Morales. She wrote, "Your grandmother used to say you saw structures other people missed. I didn't get it at first. I do now." That one stayed with me. So did the way the office changed when I came back in. Same marble lobby, same elevators, same coffee stations. But now people moved out of my way instead of through me. Not because they respected me as a person all at once. Let's be honest. A lot of them respected power. Still, even that taught me something ugly and useful. The fallout didn't stay inside the company. Within a week, the business press had the outline of it. Not every detail, but enough. Founder's granddaughter, secret will, leadership shakeup. Investors who had been politely tolerating my father for years suddenly wanted meetings. A few of them told me flat out they were staying because of my grandmother's name, not his. That hit harder than I expected, because it meant even outside the family, people had seen things I'd been trained to doubt in myself. At home, the damage kept spreading. My mother asked to meet first. We sat in a coffee shop in Midtown with 2 small tables and burnt espresso, and she apologized in this cracked-up, uneven way that sounded more real than anything I'd heard from her in years. She admitted she had hidden behind Miranda's success and my father's certainty because it was easier than feeling what they were doing to me. I didn't forgive her on the spot because that would have been fake, but I told her I was willing to try building something honest instead of polished. Miranda came later, a couple of months later, after therapy had apparently ripped the shine off the family script. She told me being the golden child had its own kind of damage, and I believed her without letting that excuse what she had done. We met on a bench in Central Park and talked like strangers trying not to stay strangers. It was awkward. It was incomplete. It was more real than anything we'd ever had growing up. By the fall, my whole life looked different in ways that still felt slightly unreal to me. I moved into a 1-bedroom in Brooklyn Heights with a view my grandmother would have loved. I took a formal role at Whitford Properties, not as CEO, because I never wanted my father's chair, but as Director of Sustainable Development. That division was my idea. Green building practices, long-term planning, real projects that asked what kind of company we were actually building instead of who got to stand at the head of the table pretending they built it alone. The salary was $185,000 a year, plus dividends from the shares. And even typing that now still feels strange, because I can remember doing math in my Queen's kitchen over grocery money and subway fare. Gerald called occasionally after he resigned. Short conversations, stiff. Weather talk, work talk, no truth. I stopped expecting truth from him, and that helped more than I can explain. My mother and I started having lunch every other week. Miranda and I got coffee sometimes on weekends. None of it was neat. None of it erased anything. But the old arrangement was dead, and that mattered more than whether everybody could say sorry the right way. What I understand now is simple, and it took me way too long to get there. My grandmother did not leave me control of that company because I was more impressive than Miranda, or because she wanted some dramatic ending after she died. She left it to me because she knew I had spent my whole life being told I was less, and somehow I still hadn't become cruel. She knew I understood what it felt like to be dismissed by people who should have protected you, and that I wouldn't build a company around that kind of blindness. For years, I thought the inheritance was the money, or the shares, or the title. It wasn't. The real inheritance was permission. Permission to stop asking the wrong people to tell me who I was. If this story meant something to you, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video, shared it with someone who needs it, and subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the next story. And I want to hear from you too. Have you ever been assigned a role in your family that had nothing to do with who you really were? If you were in my place, would you have taken that boardroom fight all the way I did, or walked away for good? And do you think some relationships can actually be rebuilt after a truth like this? Or do they just get quieter?